History books failed to mention the courageous activities of women throughout the nation and throughout the world. Somehow we learn about men, but all too often not about women. But when we did learn about women, we didn't learn what they really were all about. You know, growing up as a little girl, I grew up in an era where women were not really allowed to do all the things that we can do today. We weren't allowed to run marathons or drive race cars or be at the pits at the Indianapolis 500 as a press person. We weren't allowed in rotaries. It was just not something women were allowed to do. Why, shoot, women weren't even allowed to vote until 1920. In fact, the first woman that served in this House served there 2 full years before women had the right to vote. And when you think about all the things that have happened in this last century, we have to look to a century before to see, wow, who are the folks that really made this happen? Because it just didn't happen overnight. In the hallway out in the rotunda, there is what I think is the best statue. And it's the statue of the pioneers for women's suffrage. It's an extraordinary piece of artwork, one that depicts the likenesses of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony, arguably the women who pushed the button for women today to have true equal rights with men. These were the most pro-women feminists in the history of America. And as you will see in a few moments, the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say, for Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were just not written when I was a little girl. I'd like to begin this hour by referring to a few quotes from a couple of these foremothers that truly show where they stood in history with what I believe is the most pro-feminine issue, and that's the issue of abortion. You see, Mr. Speaker, every one of us has the right to life, born and unborn. And it is the women who have the responsibility to make sure that that baby is born. Unfortunately, our courts, over 33 years ago, decided to change that and said that women had the right to end that life. But, Mr. Speaker, we don't have that right. It is our responsibility to bear those children. And these foremothers knew that. In a letter to Julia Ward Howard in 1873, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the woman who shocked society, Mr. Speaker, by daring to leave her house proudly showing her pregnancy, because that was just not done, wrote, and I quote, "When we consider that women are treated as property, it is degrading to women to treat our children as property to be disposed of as we see fit." Now, when I was a child in school learning about the issues of women's suffrage and women's rights, I knew Elizabeth Cady Stanton was pro-woman, pro-freedom pioneer, but I didn't know she was pro-life. Shoot, I didn't know she was pro-life till a few years ago. She was hardly alone in her pro-life views. As you can see, Susan B. Anthony also expressed her thoughts about pro-life in the publication, The Revolution. Guilty? Yes. No matter what the motive, love of ease, or desire to save from suffering the unborn innocent, the woman is awfully guilty who commits the deed. It will burden her conscience in life. It will burden her soul in death. Mr. Speaker, those words were written over 100 years ago, over 150 years ago. and yet they could easily be written today. Because today, Mr. Speaker, we hear from women who've had the painful tragedy of abortion on their soul, and they talk about how their heart weeps because of the life that they gave up, and how they want not just to forgive themselves, but to protect women from that awful decision that they made to protect other women from the suffering that they have. And yet, Susan B. Anthony knew that years ago. So you see, in history, pro-life was an issue. And you know, you have to think about it, Mr. Speaker, and you have to think it makes sense, because the whole issue of abortion, it just didn't come about in the 20th century or the 21st century. It came about centuries ago. Unfortunately, indiscretions have happened throughout history. And when indiscretions happen, babies are created. And then the issue becomes, what do you do to hide the dirty little secret? Are you like Hester Prynne in Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, where you put her in prison and then put her out into the wilderness trying to hide Pearl, her beautiful daughter? In the end, only knowing that Pearl became the most beautiful little girl. What was Nathaniel Hawthorne saying about the pregnancy? What was he saying about the birth of that child? Was he saying that child had the right to life? Or was Nathaniel Hawthorne thinking other things? We don't know, but we can only wonder why he put her in prison and why he chastised her to the wilderness. But the point was, they wanted to hide the secret, and because she chose to have the child, that secret was going to be born. And so for people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the 1860s to say, wait a minute, women should have the right to get married, to get divorced, to raise their children, and oh, by the way, have their children, own property, be able to vote. We shouldn't be surprised that protecting the child and the birth of that child was part of their platform. And today, in 2011, I am very proud to stand here and carry on with their message, because today, ever more so, the assault of life is all around us. And I believe that assault of life is there because we don't recognize the meaning of life at its conception. And when you compromise it at its conception, I think you question the validity of life all the way through to its end. You know, each year, and I'm so proud to represent the 2nd Congressional District of Ohio, each year I am really proud of the hundreds of thousands of people that come out to the lawn on the Capitol in probably the coldest day in January to petition Congress to end abortion. It's called the Right to Life March. And in the 5 years that I've been in Congress, standing with them, we've yet to have a decent day. I mean, sometimes it's just cold. Sometimes it's cold and snowy. Sometimes it's cold and rainy. But it's always cold. And I stand out on a platform and I'm there for maybe an hour, but they're standing there for hours. Kids from schools are coming up in buses, traveling all night, getting off the bus only to stand on cold ground, only to get back on that bus and go right back home and go right back to school. Parents are coming with small kids, buses, cars, airplanes, caravans, asking Congress to end something that is so wrong. And as I look out on the lawn and I see these brave people, I say to myself, wow, that's what America's all about. And among the crowd, I see so many women. I believe more women than men. Because women, we have the privilege to experience childbirth, and we understand firsthand what that life is like inside a womb. And I think when we do have that experience and we understand the meaning of life, it makes us want to get out and protect it so that it can have its natural right to come into the world and be the person God wants it to be. And I do this because I'm so proud of the folks that are out there. But I also do it for some folks back home. Back when I was in high school, the whole issue of abortion began to emerge before Roe v. Wade, because states were considering whether they should legalize abortion or not. And there was a couple in Cincinnati by the name of Dr. Jack and Barbara Wilkie, he a physician, she a nurse, who were at the forefront of this movement. And they gathered people like my parents and other people around their coffee table to discuss how we could protect Ohio from legalizing abortion. And then, of course, Roe v. Wade hit in 1973, and the campaign escalated to a national debate. But along the way, and they weren't the only ones, by the way, Mr. Speaker, there were people all across coffee tables, all across America, debating how we're going to protect life. But it was Barbara among the group, and they were talking on the telephone. It was before email and Blackberries and even fax machines. We were talking on the phone long distance with one another. But it was Barbara at her kitchen table to Jack that said one day, Jack, I just don't understand this whole debate. My gosh, we're protected. Our nation protects us. It says everybody has the right to life. And he says, Barbara, that's the name of the movement. And the name of the movement was branded the National Right to Life movement. Now, Barbara and Jack Wilkie have served for many years in many capacities in this movement. Jack served as president of the National Right to Life Committee for well over a decade. They have founded the International Right to Life Federation and wrote the Handbook on Abortion, a book often described as the unofficial Bible of the pro-life movement during the 70s and 80s. They also have other groups that they work with around the world fighting all kinds of life issues, not just for the unborn, but for human trafficking and women's rights. I mention this because this couple, this simple couple from College Hill, Ohio, is just one of many across our nation that recognizes the importance of this issue and is dedicating their life to eradicating abortion. And so when I stand out on that lawn on those cold January days, each and every year, I look at people and I think there are other Jack and Barbara Wilkies, maybe not as famous, that are doing the same thing, hundreds and hundreds of thousands. And then I think of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the contemporary bearers of that message like the Wilkies. And I say, wow, there is a plan out there, and the last note on abortion hasn't been written. Alice Paul is another pretty important feminist in history. She was actually the original author of the Equal Rights Amendment. And Mr. Speaker, if you think that abortion is a hot issue, I can remember back in the 70s when the Equal Rights Amendment was being debated across this land, and the hot issue that was, oh my gosh, should we give women the same rights as men? And there were women that said, no, they need to be back in the home. And there were folks that said, no, women need to have equal pay as men. And are we going to have unity? Yeah, what are we going to do about private facilities? And it was just, an awful debate, because it really deflected from the real issue that all of us are God's creatures and all of us are created equal. And so I remember Alice Paul as being at the forefront of this and remembering the debate both in high school and college. But man, I didn't know until a few years ago that Alice Paul was pro-life. Now here's a woman that was painted as this equal rights, left-wing feminist, and yet when we look at pro-life issues, we think they're a conservative, right-wing issue. But it was Alice Paul, the original author of the Equal Rights Amendment, who stated, "Abortion is the ultimate exploitation of women." Let me repeat that. Abortion is the ultimate exploitation of women from this far-left, hard-nosed person. Add to her views the ones previously referenced, and it is difficult to see any ambiguity or confusion about where these feminists and advocates of the women's right movement stood on the issue of abortion. Simply put, they detested abortion and went as far as publicly and privately as they could in condemning it. Unfortunately, Madam Speaker, it seems as though their rhetoric has been largely lost over the years, hidden in the annals of history, and I just don't know why. Because if we don't understand the full depth of history, we'll never understand March 15th, 2011, and the views that we debate in this very chamber today. And it's sad because as a little girl, I didn't know about these pioneers. I didn't know about their pro-life positions. I didn't know that they were sisters with me. I thought they were different. I thought that the folks that stood before me to give us equal rights were pro-choice, but could be farther from the truth. I think many people wrongly believe that feminism and pro-life principles are mutually exclusive and cannot be reconciled with each other. But when you look at history, you can see that they're not exclusive, but inclusive. Because it is we, as I said earlier, that have the responsibility to have the children, to continue to procreate for the future. That is why we were put here on earth, to have children. And it is our responsibility to make sure that these children are cared for, both inside the womb and out. And for a court to say it is our right to end it, I think is exclusive of what we were made of.